Professor Adam Levis has always impressed his students with his wisdom and mystery. But when a young student suddenly disappears, the dark side of his impeccable reputation begins to surface. What is really hidden behind his flawless smile? The university town of Greenfield exuded a sense of tranquil perfection. Tidy brick buildings lined streets where trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows casting intricate patterns on cobblestone paths. Students moved purposefully, clutching books and coffee cups, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. Beneath the veneer of academic rigor and camaraderie, however, secrets festered. In one corner of the sprawling campus stood Hartwell Hall, its ivy-covered facade housing the Department of Philosophy. It was here that Dr. Adam Lewis presided over his kingdom. Dr. Lewis was a man who commanded attention without asking for it. At 45, his sharply tailored suits and penetrating gaze made him an enigmatic figure. His lectures were legendary, an intricate dance of wit and wisdom that left students spellbound. Despite his allure, Adam remained distant, his personal life cloaked in a shroud of mystery. His colleagues admired his intellect but found his aloofness unsettling. For Emma Ryan, a third-year literature major, Adam Lewis was more than a professor. He was a gateway to a world she had only dreamed of, a world of meaning and intellectual achievement. Emma was a striking young woman with a quiet determination, her bright green eyes betraying a relentless curiosity. She had an uncanny ability to ask questions that lingered in the air, unsettling in their depth. It was this quality that had drawn Adam's attention. Their paths first crossed during a late afternoon seminar on existential philosophy. While other students scribbled notes, Emma challenged Adam on a point about Sartre's views on freedom. Her argument was precise, her tone unyielding. Adam had paused, the faintest smile playing on his lips, before admitting she had made a valid point. That exchange marked the beginning of what Emma hoped would be a mentor-mentee relationship. But the dynamic soon deepened into something neither of them anticipated. Emma became a regular visitor to Adam's office hours, the small space often filled with the scent of his sandalwood cologne and the rustle of papers. Their conversations stretched beyond course material, wandering into discussions about art, human nature, and the burdens of ambition. Adam spoke of his disillusionment with academia, hinting at a sense of entrapment within the very institution that revered him. One evening, as the spring semester neared its end, Emma stayed behind after a lecture. The classroom was empty save for the two of them. The light above flickered faintly, casting shadows that danced across the walls. She had questions about her final paper, but as their conversation unfolded, it became clear that neither of them was talking purely about philosophy. "You have a rare mind, Emma," Adam said, his voice low but steady, "and a rare courage to see the world as it is, not as others want you to see it." Emma felt her cheeks flush. "I don't always feel that way," she replied. "Sometimes, it's lonely, seeing things differently." Adam's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, an unspoken tension filled the room. He broke it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Loneliness," he murmured, "can be both a gift and a curse." Summer arrived, and the campus emptied as most students returned home. Emma stayed behind to work on a research project, a convenient excuse to remain in proximity to Adam. Hartwell Hall, once bustling, now felt like a relic frozen in time. The silence of the building amplified every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of fluorescent lights. It was in this solitude that their bond began to evolve. Adam, too, seemed to linger more than necessary. He invited Emma to join him for coffee after their discussions, their meetings stretching into long, meandering walks through the campus gardens. Emma learned about his failing marriage to Clara, a distant figure shrouded in resentment. Adam spoke of the pressure to maintain appearances, the weight of expectations that left him hollow. It was during one of these walks that Emma found herself standing closer to him than usual. She could feel the heat of his presence, his words resonating in a way that was no longer purely intellectual. When he reached out to tuck a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, the gesture lingered just a moment too long. Their first kiss happened in the dim light of Adam's office, the blinds drawn tightly shut. Emma had brought him a copy of a short story she was working on, her voice trembling slightly as she asked for his thoughts. As he read, she watched his face, searching for approval. When he finished, he placed the paper on his desk and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "is remarkable." Her relief turned to a surge of emotion she couldn't contain. She stepped closer, her words tumbling out in a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. And then it happened, a moment of recklessness that neither of them could take back. His lips met hers, tentative at first, then with a growing intensity that mirrored the chaos brewing inside both of them. In the days that followed, their meetings grew more frequent, their conversations laced with stolen glances and unspoken promises. But their newfound intimacy was not without its shadows. Clara, though preoccupied with her own affairs, began to notice changes in Adam. His distracted demeanor, the way his phone seemed to be glued to his hand. Emma, too, sensed the precariousness of their situation. She became hyper-aware of the whispers in the hallways, the way her peers looked at her when Adam's gaze lingered a second too long during lectures. Yet she couldn't bring herself to step away. The allure of him, of what they shared, was too intoxicating. One sweltering July evening, Emma found herself at Adam's home for the first time. Clara was away visiting family, and the house was eerily quiet. They sat in the living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Adam poured them glasses of wine, his hands trembling slightly. "This is dangerous," Emma whispered, though there was no conviction in her voice. Adam looked at her, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. "Sometimes," he said, "danger is the only way to feel alive." They spent the night together, their passion tinged with an undercurrent of fear. But as the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, reality began to creep in. Adam's phone buzzed incessantly. Texts from Clara, colleagues, reminders of the life he was tethered to. Emma watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of longing and dread. As summer turned to fall, the cracks in their facade began to widen. Emma's friends noticed her growing withdrawal, her increasing preoccupation with her phone. Adam, once confident and composed, became jumpy, his temper flaring in uncharacteristic ways. The world they had built together, however secretive, was beginning to strain under the weight of its own deception. But neither of them could foresee just how devastating the consequences of their choices would be. By the time the leaves of Greenfield had turned to brittle gold, Emma Ryan's world felt like it was crumbling. The thrill of her connection with Adam Lewis had given way to sleepless nights and an all-consuming dread. Every glance in her direction, every whispered word among classmates, felt like judgment. She clutched her bag tighter as she walked through campus, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if their secret unraveled. Adam, too, was unraveling. His lectures, once eloquent and captivating, now felt hollow, his sentences trailing off as though his thoughts had fled. He avoided eye contact with Emma in class, fearing that even a single shared look might betray them. Each passing day seemed to tighten the noose around him, and he was suffocating under the weight of a double life. Yet neither of them could bring themselves to walk away, trapped by their own mistakes and emotions. Clara's growing suspicion. Clara Lewis had always prided herself on her ability to read people, especially her husband. She knew when his smiles were forced, when his silences carried weight. Lately, his distance had taken on a sharper edge. It wasn't just his late nights at the office or the way he guarded his phone. It was the shadow of guilt in his eyes. She'd seen it before in fleeting moments, but now it lingered, undeniable. At first, Clara dismissed her suspicions as paranoia, a natural response to the strain their marriage had endured over the years. But then she found the receipt. It was tucked carelessly in the pocket of Adam's coat. A dinner for two at a boutique restaurant she'd never heard of. The date on the receipt coincided with a night he claimed to be working late. Her hands trembled as she stared at it, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Rather than confront him outright, Clara decided to watch and wait. She began piecing together fragments of his routine, noting inconsistencies and small details that didn't add up. Her quiet resolve masked a growing fury. She wouldn't let herself be humiliated, not by Adam, and certainly not by the unknown woman who had stolen his attention. Emma's burden. Emma sat in her dorm room, staring at the tiny white stick on her desk. The two faint pink lines were undeniable, but they still didn't feel real. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty about what to do next. Her fingers hovered over her phone, drafting and deleting messages to Adam, none of them able to capture the turmoil inside her. Her roommate Melanie noticed Emma's growing withdrawal. "You've been so out of it lately," Melanie said one evening, her concern breaking through Emma's carefully constructed walls. "Is it school? Or something else?" Emma hesitated, her heart pounding. She wanted to tell someone, to share the unbearable weight of her secret, but the words refused to come. Instead, she shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "Just stressed," she muttered. In her isolation, Emma began writing everything down in a journal, her fears, her doubts, and, most damningly, her relationship with Adam. It became her outlet, a place to sort through the chaos that had consumed her life. The act of writing gave her a fragile sense of control, even as the world around her felt increasingly precarious. Clara takes action. Clara's patience paid off one crisp October evening when she followed Adam from his office. He didn't head home as expected, but instead walked briskly toward the edge of campus. Clara kept her distance, her heart racing as she trailed him to a secluded park where a young woman was waiting. The dim light from a street lamp cast long shadows, but Clara didn't need to see Emma's face to know who she was. The way Adam leaned toward her, the way she clutched at his arm, it all confirmed what Clara had suspected. As Clara watched from the shadows, her mind raced with possibilities. Confrontation would be satisfying but messy, and it wouldn't undo the betrayal. No, she needed something more decisive. When Adam finally left, she stayed behind, watching as Emma lingered for a moment before heading back toward campus. Clara followed her at a distance, her gaze fixed on the young woman she now saw as an enemy. The catalyst. A week later, Emma's journal went missing. She tore through her dorm in a panic, convinced she had simply misplaced it. But when she checked her bag, her desk, and even the common areas of her dorm, the sinking realization that it had been taken began to settle in. Her mind immediately went to Melanie, but her roommate denied any knowledge of the journal. The unease that had been growing inside Emma now morphed into outright terror. Meanwhile, Clara sat in the driver's seat of her car, parked outside a coffee shop. The journal lay open on the passenger seat, its pages filled with Emma's innermost thoughts and confessions. Clara's lips curled into a cold smile as she read. Each word was another nail in Adam's coffin, a damning record of his lies and betrayal. But the journal also revealed Emma's pregnancy, a twist Clara hadn't anticipated. Changed everything. Clara decided to confront Adam that night. She waited until he returned home, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside her. She handed him the journal without a word, watching as his face turned ashen. "We're going to talk," she said, her voice cold and steady. "And you're going to listen." Adam tried to explain, to justify his actions, but Clara cut him off. "This isn't about salvaging your excuses, Adam. This is about consequences. You end this now, or I take this to the university, the press, whoever will listen. And believe me, they will." Emma's breaking point. Emma received a text from Adam late that night. "We need to meet. Tomorrow. My office." The abruptness of his tone sent a chill through her. She arrived the next day to find him pacing, his normally composed demeanor shattered. "Clara knows," he said, his voice tight. "She has your journal." Emma's heart sank. How? How did she? "It doesn't matter how," Adam snapped. "What matters is that this has to stop. She's giving me one chance to fix this, and I can't do that if we, he trailed off, his words hanging in the air like a noose. Emma stared at him, her emotions warring between anger and despair. "So that's it," she said bitterly. "You're just going to cut me out of your life and hope it all goes away?" Adam didn't respond, his silence more damning than anything he could have said. Emma's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You're a coward," she spat. "And you'll regret this." She stormed out, leaving Adam alone in his office. But as she walked away, her resolve hardened. She wouldn't let him dictate the terms of her life. Not anymore. The unseen threat. Clara wasn't done. She had set her plans in motion, but she wanted to ensure Adam felt the full weight of her wrath. She began leaking pieces of Emma's journal anonymously, starting with passages that hinted at Adam's inappropriate behavior with a student. Whispers began circulating around campus, and the once revered professor found himself under increasing scrutiny. Emma, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in. She considered going to the university herself, exposing the truth before Clara could manipulate it further. But the thought of facing the fallout alone paralyzed her. Instead, she began drafting an email to the ethics committee, unsure if she had the courage to send it. As the tension mounted, none of them realized just how far the other was willing to go, or how devastating the consequences would be. The rain hammered against the windows of Emma's dorm room as she paced back and forth, her thoughts tangled in knots. The glow of her laptop filled the dim space, the cursor on her unsent email blinking in maddening rhythm. Her chest was tight, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her desk. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times, but every scenario ended in disaster. Her heart raced as she imagined the fallout, the whispers on campus, her professor's disappointment, her parents' shock. The knock on her door startled her. Emma froze, her pulse spiking. She hesitated, then opened it a crack to find Melanie standing there, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Are you okay?" Melanie asked, peering past her. "You've been locked in here all day." Emma tried to muster a reassuring smile but failed. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice cracked on the word. Melanie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "No, you're not. I don't know what's going on, but you're scaring me." "Is it a guy?" Her eyes softened. "You can tell me, whatever it is." Emma sank onto her bed, burying her face in her hands. The weight of it all threatened to crush her. She wanted to tell Melanie everything, to unload the truth and share the burden. But the thought of Melanie looking at her with pity, or worse, disgust, stopped her. Instead, she took a shaky breath and said, "I just made a mistake, a really big one." Melanie sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We all do," she said gently. "But whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Emma nodded, though she said nothing more. As Melanie left, Emma's gaze returned to her laptop. Her friend's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of resolve. She couldn't undo the past, but she could take control of what happened next. Clara Lewis sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the emails on her laptop with laser focus. The detective's words from the day before still lingered in her mind. "We're pursuing multiple angles. If there's anything else you'd like to share, now would be the time." Clara had smiled then, feigning cooperation, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. She knew the investigators were circling closer, and while she had the journal as leverage, she also knew it wouldn't be enough. She needed to tip the scales further in her favor. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know what you're doing. Be careful." Clara's stomach twisted, though she didn't let it show. Instead, she set her coffee down calmly and began typing a response to the university's administration, subtly planting seeds of doubt about Adam's professional conduct without directly implicating herself. It was a delicate balance, enough to nudge them toward action, but not enough to make her look like the instigator. As she pressed send, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Was she losing control of the situation? She shook it off, reminding herself that she was always one step ahead. Adam stared at his reflection in the rain-slicked window of his office. His once impeccable confidence now eroded into a brittle shell. The shadows under his eyes deepened as he replayed Clara's threats in his mind. His phone buzzed, and he grabbed it instinctively, only to see Emma's name on the screen. "We need to talk. Can't wait." He gritted his teeth, his hand tightening around the phone. Emma was becoming a liability, a loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything. Yet the idea of confronting her made his stomach churn. He needed another way to silence her. His thoughts turned to Charles Bishop. If he could convince the department head to dismiss the rumors as baseless, perhaps he could buy himself time. He knocked on Charles's door later that afternoon, his heart pounding. When the older man invited him in, Adam launched into a carefully rehearsed explanation. "I'm sure you've heard some troubling things," he began, his voice steady but strained. "But I want to assure you there's no truth to them. It's a misunderstanding. A disgruntled student trying to retaliate after receiving poor grades." Charles studied him with a skeptical gaze. "That's quite a coincidence, Adam, given the number of rumors circulating lately." "I know how it looks," Adam said, forcing a laugh. "But I'd hate to see this department dragged through the mud over something so trivial." Charles didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. "If it's so trivial, you won't mind if we proceed with an internal review." Adam's stomach dropped. "That's not necessary," he said quickly. It's already in motion," Charles interrupted, his tone final. "I suggest you cooperate fully, for your sake and the department's." Adam left the office in a daze. The walls were closing in faster than he'd anticipated. Desperation clawed at him as he realized he had no choice but to confront Emma. Emma waited in the library, her leg bouncing nervously as she watched the rain streak the windows. When Adam finally arrived, his face was pale, his jaw tight. He sat across from her without a word, the tension between them heavy and suffocating. "What do you want, Emma?" he asked finally, his voice low and sharp. She hesitated, her fingers curling into fists. "I just want to know the truth. About us. About what I meant to you." Adam sighed, rubbing his temples. He paused, searching for the right words. "You were a mistake." The words hit her like a slap. She recoiled, her throat tightening as tears threatened to spill. "A mistake," she whispered. "That's all." "I didn't mean," he began, but she cut him off. "Don't lie to me, Adam. Not now." Her voice broke, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "I gave up everything for you, and you're just going to pretend it didn't mean anything?" He leaned forward, his expression softening briefly. "Emma, I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And now you're trying to erase me." Adam said nothing, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were filled with defiance. "You can't control me anymore," she said. "I won't let you." She stood and walked away, leaving him sitting alone in the dim library. Adam's chest tightened as he watched her go. He knew she meant it, and he knew she was dangerous. Clara watched the exchange from a nearby aisle, her heart pounding. She hadn't planned to follow Adam, but when she saw him enter the library, she couldn't resist. Now, as she pieced together the fragments of their conversation, her mind raced with possibilities. Emma wasn't just a problem for Adam anymore. She was a problem for Clara, too. As Clara slipped out of the library, the storm outside mirrored the chaos inside her. The game had shifted again, and this time, she wasn't sure who held the upper hand. The storm had passed, leaving Greenfield soaked and shivering under a gray sky. Clara Lewis sat in her car at the edge of campus, her fingers drumming rhythmically on the steering wheel. Across the parking lot, the lights in the administration building flickered on as staff began to arrive. Clara had been waiting for this moment. She grabbed her phone, scrolled to the email chain with Charles Bishop, and reread the last message. She had made her play by planting the seed of doubt, and now it was time to cultivate it. Clara stepped out of the car, the click of her heels sharp against the wet pavement. Inside, the building smelled of stale coffee and freshly printed paper. She found Charles in his office, hunched over a folder, his reading glasses perched precariously on the edge of his nose. He glanced up, his expression neutral but curious. "Mrs. Lewis," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "This is an unexpected visit." Clara smiled tightly, lowering herself into the seat. "I thought it was best to speak in person. There's something I need to share." something that could have serious implications for the university. Charles leaned back, removing his glasses. Go on. Clara took a breath, her voice steady. Adam has been involved with a student. It's a relationship that's inappropriate on every level, and I believe it's beginning to affect his work. Charles's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. These are serious accusations. Do you have any evidence? I wouldn't come to you without it. Clara slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of pages from Emma's journal, selectively chosen excerpts that painted Adam in the worst possible light. Charles opened it, scanning the contents, his brow furrowing as he read. This is damning, he said finally, his voice heavy. And you're certain about the student's identity? Clara nodded. Her name is Emma Ryan. She's in his philosophy class. I'm concerned for her well-being, and for the university's reputation. Charles sighed, closing the folder. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll handle it from here. As Clara left the office, her heels clicking against the tile floor, she allowed herself a small smile. Charles was predictable, and she had no doubt he would take action. But as she stepped into the damp air, her confidence wavered. This wasn't over, and she knew it. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly around her phone. Detective Harper's voice still echoed in her ears, his request for a meeting sending her heart into overdrive. She replayed his words, searching for hidden meanings, but all she found was dread. Her roommate, Melanie, leaned against the doorway, watching her with concern. You've been acting weird for weeks, she said. Now you're jumping every time your phone rings. What's going on? Emma hesitated, her throat tightening. It's complicated. Melanie crossed her arms. Complicated how? Are you in trouble? Emma looked at her friend, the urge to confide warring with the fear of being judged. I don't know. I think someone's trying to ruin me. Melanie frowned, stepping closer. Ruin you? What are you talking about? Emma took a deep breath. There's this professor, and her voice faltered, the weight of her confession too much to bear. Is this about that detective who called? Melanie asked gently. What did they want? Emma nodded, her voice barely a whisper. They want to talk about him. About us? Melanie's eyes widened, but she said nothing, instead sitting beside Emma and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone. Adam was pacing the length of his office, the bottle of whiskey on his desk untouched for once. His thoughts churned as he considered his options. Clara's threats had backed him into a corner, and now Charles was involved. The walls were closing in faster than he could manage. He grabbed his phone and dialed Emma's number, his fingers trembling. It went to voicemail, and he cursed under his breath. He couldn't afford for her to spiral out of control, not now. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands. He needed a plan, something to stop this avalanche before it buried him entirely. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Charles entered without waiting for an invitation, his expression grim. We need to talk. Adam stiffened, his pulse racing. Of course, he said, forcing a smile. What's on your mind? Charles dropped the folder onto Adam's desk, the contents spilling out. This was brought to my attention today. Care to explain? Adam's blood ran cold as he recognized the journal pages. His throat tightened, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. This is absurd. Where did you get this? That's irrelevant, Charles said sharply. The question is whether it's true. Adam's mind raced. Denial was his only option. Of course not. This is a smear campaign, Charles. Someone's trying to sabotage me. Charles studied him for a moment, his gaze piercing. I hope for your sake you're telling the truth. Because if this is verified, your career here is over. As Charles left, Adam slumped in his chair, his hands trembling. The ground beneath him was crumbling, and he had no way to stop it. The next morning, Emma sat in the cold, sterile room of the police station, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Detective Harper sat across from her, his calm demeanor doing little to ease her nerves. Miss Ryan, he began, sliding a folder across the table. I need you to confirm if these documents are yours. Emma's breath caught as she opened the folder, her own handwriting staring back at her. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she closed it. Yes, she said quietly. They're mine. Harper leaned back, his gaze steady. Why don't you tell me how this started? Emma hesitated, her throat tight. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far. And Professor Lewis? What was his role in this? Harper pressed. Emma looked away, tears welling in her eyes. He used me, promised me things, made me believe. Her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes angrily. It doesn't matter now. It does, Harper said firmly. Because right now, you're the only one who can tell us the truth. Emma took a shaky breath, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. He said it was my fault, she whispered, that I ruined his life. But he was the one who… The words caught in her throat, but Harper didn't press further. He closed the folder and stood. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Ryan. We'll be in touch. As Emma left the station, the weight on her shoulders felt heavier than ever. But for the first time, she felt a spark of resolve. This wasn't over, not yet. The air in Clara's kitchen was heavy with the smell of burnt toast. She had forgotten about the bread in the toaster while pacing the room. Her phone clutched in one hand, a folder stuffed with printed emails in the other. The detective's message sat open on the screen, and Clara read it for the third time. We need to discuss your previous statements. Let me know when you're available. Clara took a slow breath and set her phone on the counter. She couldn't let Harper rattle her. She needed control, precision. Her hands tightened around the folder. There was only one way to ensure that. 15 minutes later, she was driving toward a nondescript office building downtown. She parked, grabbed the folder, and headed inside. The building's lobby was dimly lit and empty save for a bored receptionist who barely glanced up as Clara stepped into the elevator. On the third floor, she was greeted by a lean man with graying hair and sharp eyes. He motioned her into a private room lined with filing cabinets. You're late, the man said, his voice low and clipped. I wasn't aware this was on your schedule, Clara replied smoothly, her confidence returning. She handed him the folder. This is everything you'll need. You know what to do. The man flipped through the pages, his eyebrows raising slightly at one document. You're sure about this? Could get messy. It's already messy, Clara said. I'm just making sure I'm not the one who gets buried. The man nodded, slipping the folder into a briefcase. I'll make the call tonight. You won't hear from me again unless there's a problem. Clara left the office feeling a flicker of relief. The man was reliable, discreet, efficient, and loyal to no one but the highest bidder. If he did his job, the situation would shift back in her favor. But the unease in her chest remained. Harper wasn't the only one digging, and every move she made carried the risk of exposure. In the library, Emma sat across from Melanie, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The muted hum of students whispering and turning pages filled the air, but Emma's focus was on Melanie, who was staring at her with growing suspicion. Let me guess, Melanie said, leaning back in her chair. This is about Professor Lewis. Emma flinched, her fingers tightening. What? Oh, come on, Melanie said, lowering her voice. I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you avoid looking at him. Something's going on, and it's not just academic. Emma's chest tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Emma, Melanie said, her tone sharper now. I heard you talking to someone on the phone last night. You said his name. You were upset. Just tell me the truth. Emma opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, her eyes darted to her bag, where her phone buzzed softly. Melanie's gaze followed, and her frown deepened. Is that him? Melanie asked. No, Emma said quickly, grabbing the phone and silencing the call. It's just a reminder. Melanie didn't look convinced. Whatever you're caught up in, you need to be careful. If he's involved, it's not just your reputation at stake. Emma stared at her, her stomach twisting. What do you mean? Melanie hesitated, then leaned closer. Let's just say Professor Lewis has been friendly with students before, and it didn't end well. Before Emma could respond, Melanie stood, gathering her things. Think about it. Okay? I'm here if you need me. As Melanie walked away, Emma's mind raced. She had thought she was the only one, but Melanie's words suggested otherwise. If Adam had done this before, how many others had been hurt, and what had happened to them? Detective Harper walked briskly through the quad, his leather jacket damp from the misty rain. His morning had been spent combing through a trove of emails that had mysteriously arrived in his inbox overnight. The correspondence was between Adam and an unidentified student, and while the language was careful, the subtext was unmistakable. Harper's lips tightened as he approached the philosophy department. Professor Bishop, Harper said, catching the older man outside his office. Do you have a moment? Charles Bishop adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowed. Detective Harper, what can I do for you? It's about Adam Lewis, Harper said, his voice even. I've received additional evidence suggesting inappropriate conduct. I was hoping you could shed some light on his relationships with students. Charles hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the closed door of his office. Adam has always been intense, dedicated to his work, but I wouldn't call him inappropriate. Have there been complaints? Harper pressed. Charles sighed. Nothing formal. A few rumors over the years, but that's common in academia. Rumors can lead to patterns, Harper said, and patterns can reveal the truth. Charles didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. If there's a pattern, detective, I hope you find it. For everyone's sake. At 8 p.m., Emma knocked on the door of Adam's office. Her heart pounded as she waited, her breath fogging the glass. When Adam opened the door, his expression was guarded, his eyes dark. You came, he said, stepping aside to let her in. You said we needed to talk, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Adam closed the door, leaning against the desk. What do you want from me, Emma? An apology? An explanation? Because I don't have one. I want the truth, Emma said, stepping closer. How many others have there been? Am I just another one of your mistakes? Adam's jaw tightened. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Emma demanded, her voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you use people and throw them away when they're no longer convenient. Adam's gaze dropped, his hands clenching the edge of the desk. You don't understand. Then make me understand, Emma shouted. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of their ragged breathing. Finally, Adam looked up, his eyes filled with something Emma couldn't name. Guilt, anger, regret. I never meant for this to happen, he said quietly. But it did. And now we're both paying for it. Emma shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I trusted you, and you destroyed me. Before Adam could respond, Emma turned and left, slamming the door behind her. Adam sank into his chair, his head in his hands. He didn't notice the shadowy figure lingering at the end of the hallway, watching Emma leave. The dim hallway outside Adam's office was silent, save for the faint echo of Emma's retreating footsteps. Adam sat motionless at his desk, his thoughts churning with the weight of her accusations. For the first time, the walls he had meticulously built around his life felt paper-thin, fragile enough to collapse with the slightest push. But it wasn't over yet. His phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up with Clara's name. We need to talk, she said when he answered. Her voice was calm, but Adam recognized the edge beneath it. Now, Clara, I don't have time for... I'm outside your office, she interrupted. Open the door. Adam's stomach sank. He crossed the room, pulling the door open to find Clara standing there, perfectly composed, her coat pulled tightly around her. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Did you know, Clara began, her voice sharp and deliberate, that Detective Harper has evidence from another source? Emails, Adam. Between you and Emma. Adam froze. What emails? The kind that paint a very clear picture of your relationship, Clara said, her eyes narrowing. Do you have any idea who sent them? Because I do. Clara, I swear. Don't, she snapped, cutting him off. This isn't about your excuses. It's about how far I'm willing to go to protect myself. Adam's throat tightened. What does that mean? Clara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. It means you have two options. You take responsibility for everything. Emma, the emails, all of it, or I'll make sure the entire story leads straight back to you. Do you understand? Adam stared at her, his mind racing. You'd ruin me. Clara's smile was cold. You ruined yourself. She turned and left without another word, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Adam sank back into his chair, the weight of her ultimatum pressing down on him. He had underestimated her, and now she held all the cards. Across campus, Emma sat in her dorm room, staring at the email draft she had been rewriting for hours. The words blurred on the screen as her mind replayed the confrontation with Adam. She wanted to believe that exposing the truth would bring her closure, but instead, it felt like stepping into quicksand. Every move seemed to pull her deeper. Her phone buzzed. It was Detective Harper. Miss Ryan, he said when she answered. I need you to come to the station tomorrow morning. There's been a development. Emma's pulse quickened. What kind of development? I'd prefer to discuss it in person, Harper said. Can you make it at 9? Emma agreed reluctantly, her hands trembling as she ended the call. Something had shifted, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited her at the station would change everything. Detective Harper sat in his office, flipping through the growing stack of evidence. The anonymous emails had been a bombshell, corroborating Emma's journal and painting a damning portrait of Adam Lewis. But something still didn't add up. The timeline was too clean, the details too precise. Harper's instincts told him someone else was pulling the strings. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. An officer stepped inside, holding a folder. This just came in, the officer said. Anonymous tip. Again, Harper opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. It was a bank statement, Clara Lewis's bank statement. A large, unexplained withdrawal stood out, dated the same day the emails had been sent. Harper leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Mrs. Lewis, he murmured. What game are you playing? The next morning, Emma arrived at the police station, her nerves frayed. Harper greeted her with a calm but unreadable expression, leading her to a small interview room. I need to ask you about these, Harper said, sliding a printout of the emails across the table. Emma's eyes widened as she read them. I didn't send these, she said quickly. I don't even have these emails. I know, Harper said, watching her closely. But someone did. And whoever it was, they wanted me to believe it was you. Emma's heart raced. Clara, she whispered. Harper nodded. It's a possibility. She's been cooperative, but her motives are questionable. And there's this. He slid the bank statement across the table. She paid someone. A significant amount. Do you know anything about that? Emma shook her head, her mind reeling. What happens now? Harper leaned forward. Now I need you to make a choice. You can step back and let us handle this, or you can help us. But if you choose to help, it won't be easy. Emma hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Then she nodded. I'll help. That evening, Clara sat alone in her living room, a glass of wine in her hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did nothing to ease her tension. She had expected Harper to confront her by now, but the silence was worse. She felt like a chess player waiting for the opponent's move, knowing it could be the one that ended the game. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Adam. We need to meet. One last time. My office. Midnight. Clara stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She finished her wine in one long sip, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. When Clara arrived at Adam's office, the lights were off, and the hallway was eerily silent. She knocked once before pushing the door open. Adam stood by the window, his back to her. What do you want, Adam? She demanded, her voice sharp. He turned slowly, his face pale but composed. To end this, Clara folded her arms. And how do you plan to do that? Adam stepped closer, his voice low. I take the blame. Everything. The emails, the journal, the manipulation. You walk away clean, Clara's eyes narrowed. Why would you do that? Because I have nothing left to lose, Adam said simply. And because I loved you once. For a moment, Clara hesitated. Then she nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. Fine. But you'd better follow through. She turned to leave, but before she could open the door, the hallway filled with the sound of footsteps. Detective Harper appeared, flanked by 2 officers. Clara Lewis, Harper said, his voice firm. We need to talk. Clara's composure faltered as the officers stepped forward, placing her under arrest. Adam watched in stunned silence as she was led away, her head held high despite the tension in her jaw. Harper turned to Adam, his expression unreadable. Your turn, he said. The fallout was swift and brutal. Clara's involvement in orchestrating the leaks and bribing witnesses came to light, unraveling her carefully constructed facade. Adam resigned from the university in disgrace, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Emma, though vindicated, chose to leave Greenfield, seeking a fresh start far from the shadows of her past. As the dust settled, Detective Harper sat in his office, staring at the final report. The case was closed, but the echoes of its consequences lingered. In the end, no one emerged unscathed. The quiet of Greenfield returned, but beneath its surface, the scars remained. A reminder of how lies, ambition, and betrayal could tear even the most stable lives apart.